Right, hello everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to SR Conversations. As you've probably noticed, I'm not Louise Speakman. Louise couldn't make it today, but we are hosting this and Maria has kindly come along to speak. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This will be recorded and we have actually enabled the Q&A feature at the top in the toolbar in Teams. So if people do have questions throughout the session, if you can put them in the Q&A, that would be great. The chat is also enabled for everyone, so if you want to drop in comments as we go, my colleague here at Lancaster is going to keep an eye on the chat. And there will also be a feedback form in the chat area at the end of the session, which would be nice if you could fill that in and bring it back to us. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Maria. So if you were at Lilac last year, some of you may recognise Maria as she was one of the keynote speakers and touched on some key accessibility issues that impact educational settings and libraries. And today, Maria is going to talk about communication and liaison between information specialists, librarians and researchers. So things like, how do we make connections to get involved in projects? How do we negotiate time allocation? How do we allocate tasks, look at author contributions, and what works best from the librarian perspective? So Maria works as a subject librarian for health and social care at Edinburgh Napier University, but has just confessed she's a local Lancashire girl. And she is involved in reviews as one part of her job role alongside the regular supporting undergraduate, postgrad students, researchers with literature searching, referencing, collection management, and copyright and publishing queries. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Maria.
Thank you very much, Bob, and welcome everyone who's joining us today. So I'm hoping that you can see my slides already. If you can't, please do let us know in the chat. Today's session will be quite interactive and I'll be asking for a lot of contributions from yourselves as participants, mostly through a Menti, but my first one will be using the chat. So we'll get onto that in a second. So what we'll be covering today then is, as Bob summarised, various elements of sort of the evidence synthesis and review involvement from the librarian and information specialist perspective. So how we might initiate contact or get involved with these reviews, and then collaboration and negotiation throughout that process, such as time, resources, alongside your other responsibilities, touching on authorship. But a really key element that I wanted to sort of get out today was this idea of sharing best practice and ideas, and getting in touch with Louise and suggesting to run this session came about really from when I first started in the role at Edinburgh Napier and I was taking more responsibility and involvement with reviews. It was quite a solo thing for me to do. There wasn't really other people in my team who were doing that. It's not necessarily an information specialist team. So I felt a little bit like, who shall I go to and how can I get advice from others? And I felt that potentially there could be other people who are maybe feeling quite solo in that sense, at other institutions and workplaces. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to sort of share what we do with each other. So I first of all want to get a kind of idea of who might be here. So I'm going to ask you to use the meeting chat for this rather than the Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing what your job title is. I'm hoping I can see the meeting chat, but it does tell me in the settings actually, Bob, that this meeting chat is muted. So I don't know if, let me see, unmute. Okay, yeah, I've got it now. That's fine. That's my settings. That's fine. Okay, I can see all the messages. So I just want to get a picture of what the different job roles of people who are attending today might be and how that might impact your role in terms of involvement with reviews. So I'm not going to go through every single response, but you can see that we have a range of liaison librarian, subject librarian, academic success, clinical effectiveness, information specialist. So this seems to be quite a range of people who are working in healthcare specific libraries, and we'll come on to that, as well as people who are working within university settings. And I can see that there's people who are specifically stating, you know, NHS, knowledge specialists. So there seems to be quite a good range of different people here, which is interesting to see. Now at this point, I'm going to go into the Menti, and we've got another couple of questions about your responsibilities and your workplace, again to help get a good idea of the range of participants here, and then I'll cover some more depth about my own role and responsibilities as well. So I'm just going to change the screen over to the Menti, and there's a code at the top there. I'll type that in the chat as well. So if you can just go to menti.com on a separate browser window or a separate device. And the first question is just trying to gauge the different requirements of roles that you might have. And there's quite a few of us, so I'll give us a couple of minutes to respond. And there might be a number of these that you do, so it might not just be one response, so it should be set up to allow you to give multiple responses.
Excuse me, can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Sorry, I mean, it's asking me for this code, which I don't know what to put in.
So the code is just at the top of the screen share. So it's 33999601.
It's not allowing for multiple responses.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. The other ones are definitely set up for multiple responses. I may not have changed that one slide. Okay, so for those of you who may have only picked the one that you do more often, I think this is giving a good range that actually the majority of us are potentially doing more support of others undertaking reviews than maybe always undertaking reviews ourselves. And again, I can see a couple of comments in the chat there about potentially all being part of the role, but some at certain times are more prioritised and deprioritised over others. And I'm going to move the slide on, which is just asking which description best fits your workplace. Again, just to give a good indication of where everybody who's joining us today is from. And if anybody feels that their workplace doesn't fit into any of these three categories, feel free to share in the chat how you would categorise your workplace. Okay, so most people here are from a higher education institute or an NHS library. Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to go back into the slides and just talk a little bit more about my role and my responsibilities around evidence synthesis and reviews. So I do sort of fit into all of those three categories within that Menti. So support both for undergraduate, postgraduate and researchers and staff who are undertaking reviews themselves. And that will involve embedded teaching, one-to-one support, managing guidance online, asynchronous resources and so on. That's particularly through the School of Health and Social Care, but I do also support our Department for Learning and Teaching. So that covers some programs of study, both internal and external, and then the CPD of any member of internal staff related to teaching and learning. And I have been involved in reviews and review support through the Education Department as well as the Health and Social Care. And my remit covers information and digital literacy quite broadly. So whilst reviews are part of that, there's actually a really wide range of spectrum, like literature searching just generally, referencing, reference management and publishing and so on. The generic job description for my role does not actually include any sort of mention of subject-specific relation sort of tasks. So things like evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, because they have traditionally been quite healthcare specific in a lot of fields, have not necessarily always done those historically. There's no mention of that task in my job role as such. However, I do support primarily postgraduate students who are doing literature reviews at master's level dissertations, and then PGY students, and then any staff and researchers who are writing for publication. And then I started being approached by academic staff to be part of review teams, primarily with this information specialist role. So that's something that sort of naturally was requested, but not necessarily officially part of my job role, let's just say. And that's the point when I started reaching out to the community, and I used a couple of the GISMail mailing lists to try and reach out and find out what others were doing, to maybe sort of get a better idea of how I should approach that element of my work. So in terms of how I get involved with these reviews, I try and negotiate my availability and workload with the academics and researchers, because it does obviously need to fit alongside a lot of other elements. The review support is not the only or even the main part of my job role. So there is that a lot of negotiation there. And I've sort of made a personal decision to only try and work on 3 reviews at one time. But even within that, I would try and stagger when I start those, because I was finding it quite difficult to be at the same stage, because obviously some stages actually are more time intensive than others when you're supporting reviews, and if you're at the same stage with multiple reviews, that's quite competing in terms of demand. So I try and stagger these sort of start dates of when I become involved. And then there was some research by Buller et al. A few years ago, which when I reached out to the community to say sort of what kind of estimates and guidance are you sort of committing to, this research was mentioned by a couple of people who said that they actually use this as a sort of a guideline for how long they commit to review involvement. And the mean time this research found of librarian involvement was just over 30 hours. So in my university, my time is actually costed every time I'm involved in a review. So the lead researcher would need to cost 30 hours of my time into, say, a bid, if they were putting forward a funding bid, and that would then get added to our internal sort of repository system, if you will, which also acts as our research proposal system, and then my department gets that cost back to their budget. So that money does not come to me personally, or even sort of my line manager. It goes to sort of our overall team. So I'm going to go back to the Menti at this point, and what I'm looking for is some sort of sharing of ideas and other guidance and sort of tips of what you do in terms of workload management and negotiation tips. So some of that might align with what I do and how I sort of manage my time, but some of that might differ. So I'm going to go back to the Menti screen, where you will have free text responses to share. That is a very interesting question. Does it mean that I get backfill for my time? No, it does not. So I am still required, like there's nothing that I then get to do less of because of this. So I suppose in a way, like when I started discussing this with my manager in terms of, you know, I'm getting these requests through, this is something that I have the capacity to take on and I'm interested in doing. And my manager basically said, that's fine, but we can't take any tasks off you. So you will need to sort of fit that in around other things, and my manager doesn't necessarily see that as the primary priority of my job. So then I do need to ensure I am prioritizing embedded teaching support at all levels before I would then take on the role of an information specialist in a review team. So that does have a sort of competing demand. Now, unfortunately, we're getting a few people saying that they don't manage the workload very well with this, or very badly, which, yeah, I think that's what Alison was potentially trying to work out from that question there about this idea of the backfill. Really interesting comment there about utilising AI tools. So if anybody wants to share more, whether you want to put that in the chat, about how you might utilise AI tools to help with that more effectively. Setting clear boundaries at the start of the project, yeah, so I'm going to come on to sort of talk about the boundaries and the sort of things that I set out, and we can have some further discussion around that. Yeah, this idea that actually at certain times of the year there's loads of different projects coming through, and maybe other times of the year aren't that great. So that's something that I'm quite clear on with academics. If somebody reaches out to me, I will say, yes, I can get involved, but not until X date, or these are the time periods, like I could be involved between these months. Does that work for you? And if it doesn't, sometimes I can be flexible on that, but not to the point where I'm just going to say yes to everything. And I think getting used to not just saying yes to everything is something that maybe some, me included, could get better at. Yeah, first come, first served. Yeah, and that is kind of the way I have to work as well, because there isn't necessarily anybody else in my team who I can then sort of say, I'll get that person involved instead. Managing expectations, yeah, definitely. Okay, booking system, interesting, yeah. Okay. Oh, that's quite good. So yeah, you're working on one at one time and then you're giving yourself that time break. So I think that partly might depend on your role, because there will be some people here today whose job role is specifically as an information specialist, whose primary job role is to support and undertake reviews, and that will be quite different to people who, like myself, potentially, who are fitting that in alongside quite a wide range of different priorities, and maybe this isn't the only or the main priority. Okay, I'm going to come back into the slides. I can see there's some other things come through in the chat, and Bob has asked people to put it in the Q&A, so I'm not going to pick up any of those for the time being. So in terms of how to sort of promote involvement, I think this obviously will differ for all of us depending on our job roles, and maybe an interesting question that some of you who are in sort of a team and a job role as a designated information specialist might want to sort of contribute some thoughts in the chat. If you have that sort of team, particularly at more research intensive universities or a healthcare library, if you have that team whose designated role is for undertaking reviews and review support, do you find that researchers are therefore more encouraged to get in touch with you to be part of a review team? And I think I've found for myself, it tends to work on word of mouth. So quite often somebody will reach out to me and say, oh, so-and-so mentioned that you worked with them on our review and they were, thought it was really great. Would you be interested in doing one with me as well? Or somebody who I might have done one with previously and then is sort of coming back to ask again. So that kind of word of mouth promotion from other people I've worked with is probably the main way that people reach out to me. But I do promote it as something I can support with when I do new staff inductions, whether that's at individual level or at sort of like a grander scale. And then if I'm mentioning something in a particular newsletter, so I have like a monthly newsletter I send out, and there might be times of the year where I say I have capacity to take on new reviews, or we have 2 internal funding opportunities throughout the year at Napier. So when that call for funding projects goes out, I will sort of follow that up with one to say, if anyone's looking for funding for a project that involves a review, I might have capacity. So kind of getting that messaging out, but also sort of making it clear when and where I do have the space for involvement, I think is quite a key one as well for me. And I think a really key thing to consider here is, what is the motivation of researchers to involve librarians? And I've got a reference list at the end, which has a really interesting paper that's quite a recent one about researchers' motivations, and the main finding is there is because they want somebody to support the evidence searching stage. They see the information specialist role as potentially the key skill there, and maybe an area where they're less skilled in, and they want that expertise. And I don't think that's necessarily a surprise, but I think I've experienced people who potentially don't necessarily always see an information specialist as more skilled than them as a content expert, if that makes sense, or a field expert. So I don't know if other people have any sort of thoughts about, motivation there. But I would like to, again, capture some of your ideas about how that works in your workplace. So how are people encouraged to get involved with you? How do you tend to find people reach out to you? So I'm going to go back to the Menti so that you've got the opportunity to share how that works as well. So any sort of tips and best practice, first of all, that you have for negotiating your involvement. Pop the code in the chat as well. I'm just going to pick up and have a quick look through the chat and the questions whilst you're responding to that one. Well, that's a good question from Deirdre that's come through about sort of being the only one. So I've got a bit of a slide about that coming up actually, so I'm going to pick that up then. Thank you, Deirdre. Yeah, that's a good question as well about the fact that if the money's coming back into the team, is there then that opportunity to almost sort of like request that there is this role created? And that's an interesting one because we've been having some discussions as a team about the fact that even outside the healthcare school, reviews across other sort of multidisciplinary areas are increasing. So as well as we have an applied sciences school where the psychology team sits and they are already involved in reviews, but it's becoming more common across wider science, social sciences, business and education, and some aspects of engineering. So I don't necessarily think the evidence synthesis and reviews in more of a systematic process or necessarily just as tied to healthcare as they once were. So there's definitely potential, and it'd be interesting to see if, I can see a couple of other people mentioning in the chat about other areas like sports science, forensics, where again, these sort of reviews are taking place more commonly now, and whether, is this just a healthcare role anymore? Okay, so I'm going to have a look through some of these sort of tips that you've added into the Menti there about negotiation. Required a protocol. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, just be honest about your availability. And I think that comes back to the idea of, do we just say yes to everything? Partly because we want to be helpful people. We don't want to put people off approaching us in the future if we say no. Sometimes for me, it's this opportunity to, my own CPD and being able to publish something that's quite noteworthy, if you will, because I've actually been involved in the Scottish Government COVID inquiry. So Napier won the bid to do the literature review that's feeding into the government investigation. So that's quite a high profile publication to have your name on. So if you're given opportunity, sometimes you don't want to say no, because actually that could hurt you professionally as well. A policy, that's good, because I've got a slide coming up about sort of policies and documentation and how we sort of set out our involvement and support. Okay, yeah, not necessarily advertising it, but you're still getting requests through and discussing those timescales. And I think it's this sort of, some of us might have more flexibility in negotiation possibilities than others. Yep, starting with this conversation and not over promising. Yep. yeah, where people are in the queue. That you sound very popular. And yeah, I think it's this really clear sort of boundaries of what the library can help with and what we can't. And I've got something coming up in a second about what it is that we actually do, what sort of areas that we say that we can be involved in and what we say we can't do. Yeah, what your limitations. I'm definitely having these conversations and meeting with people. Like, I wouldn't necessarily get involved with something without that initial conversation as well. Yeah, researchers aren't always clear what your involvement can be. Exactly. Definitely agree there. Okay, so I'm going to move on to that second question then about your institution particularly. How are sort of researchers and academics asked to be involved? How are they encouraged to involve you in your role? So what sort of systems are there in place there or processes? I think there's a good comment that's come from somebody in the chat there about people approaching you for support, and if you give different advice than what they've been given by maybe like a supervisor. I've definitely had that where somebody's met up with me for like literature searching advice, and they said, oh, my supervisor didn't say that, or my supervisor said something different. And sometimes from a student perspective, I think there's this automatic assumption that the academic is the right and in the right about something, even if it's maybe sort of a searching query rather than something content specific. And then, as Lisa said in the chat there, can cause disengagement with you. And I can see others are agreeing with that. Okay. So a lot of people saying same as me, a lot of word of mouth, and depends on the research school. I think it's, yeah, there's a lot of variety across what happens. And in terms of like support, yeah, supervisors, probably the same for myself, that I think I'm quite fortunate in the school that I work in really value the expertise of library staff or various other professional services staff, and they would not necessarily see themselves as the expert in everything. So they will signpost to relevant other teams, you know, who do have expertise in certain areas, but I'm aware that that's not necessarily the same everywhere. People just show up. They don't even have to be encouraged, they're just showing up. So that's good in a way, because they're seeing the value of your support anyway. And no sort of like formal processes as such. Okay, yeah, and then sometimes I think I've come across this before as well, where a research assistant's been hired to do a review, but they've not necessarily got a lot of review experience. So they're actually reaching out for support from you, even if you're not technically doing the review as well. Yeah. Oh, okay. So that's a requirement from research funders. That's a really interesting point. I've not personally come across anybody reaching out to me to say it's a requirement of a research funder, but I think with standalone reviews, a lot of that isn't necessarily funded, or if it is, it's only funded internally. I think most of the time where we're getting external funding, it's primarily for primary research or a project that's including a literature review and primary research. So that would be the only sort of externally funded involvement I've had with reviews. Okay, yep, signing agreements and then defining roles, that's great. So I think a lot of sort of similar experiences for me, but also some really interesting differences there of what's going on across different institutions. Okay, I'm going to come back into my slides. So in terms of my requirements then, and we've already started to pick this up, that some people are saying they do have these meetings and these agreements and setting this sort of basis of how this is going to work. So even before I agree to get involved in any review, I request information about what the background and introduction is, and also what the purpose is. So are we updating a previous review? Is this coming out of some sort of researcher funding? Is it part of a bigger project where this is just a standalone element? Is it connected to a piece of primary research? Is it just a standalone idea that, you know, a researcher might just be interested in exploring and they're just wanting to do an initial scoping review on the topic? So there can be a really wide range of reasons why people are obviously undertaking the reviews, and I try and get that information right from the start. I also ask for quite clear research questions, aims and objectives, and the eligibility criteria, so that I know exactly what the expectations are, what we're trying to discover through this review. And then at this point, I would also have these conversations around what my expectations are in terms of how this is going to work, in terms of timescales, responsibilities, what I will or won't be able to support, whether it's going to require costing, and for any review that I'm actually going to be the lead searcher on, I require author contribution. So I make that clear right from the start that if I will be carrying out the searches on behalf of the review team, then I do need author contribution for that. There might be times where I'm not doing that, but I'm supporting a research assistant who maybe is doing it for the first time. And in that case, I wouldn't necessarily require that author contribution. So it depends on my level of involvement. And within the review team, my involvement can cover these areas. So not necessarily always all of them, but the majority of the time it would. So quite often people are getting in touch with me before they've even done the protocol. So I would be involved in protocol or even proposal stage if somebody's wanting to put the proposal to a funding bid. So covering that sort of planning of the search strategy elements and writing that up for a proposal or protocol. And then, especially if it's an author contribution review, I would lead the development of the search strategy. And there was a really good question that came up earlier in the chat about who does your peer reviews of your search terms and things like that. So primarily up until this point, I have sent my search strategy back to the research team to do the peer review. Often because I'm wanting them to look over the search terms as content knowledge experts to say, are there any key terms here that as experts of this topic you think are potentially missing? So that's primarily one of the main questions that I'm asking in the peer review, because I don't have a healthcare degree. Healthcare as a topic field is not my sort of professional background. So there will sometimes be terminology that is unfamiliar to me that I want to be sort of confirmed by the subject experts. But the question in the chat was really good, because actually in terms of a sort of search strategy and information literacy sort of specialist role, I haven't really had that previously, but that is changing a little bit, which I'll pick up on in a little while. And then primarily running the searches, but there are some sort of limitations of where I sort of say I might not be the best person to run the searches. So database searching, places like Google Scholar, our library catalogue, searching in journals directly, the citation searching and so on, all of that is what I would do. So primarily searching for the academic literature. If it's a review that involves a lot of grey literature searching, I would then potentially ask other members of the review team to do some of that, potentially from a workload perspective. So with the recent Scottish Government COVID review, we were searching news sources, we were searching for guidelines and procedures and policies that were published by both NHS Scotland and the Scottish Government. We were looking at reports and grey literature published by charities, organisations and so on. So the literature searching was so varied and wide that actually I took the lead on the academic searching, and other members of the team took the lead on various other elements of that searching. So it does depend on the actual individual review type and sources included and where we might be searching in terms of which bits I do. There are sometimes times when I deduplicate the results and then share that with the rest of the research team. At the moment, we don't have access to any systematic review software. However, we have recently done a trial of Confidence from Rayan, however you pronounce it. So as part of that trial, anybody who started a review has been able to carry on with it. So there are some reviews I'm involved in where Confidence is being used, so the deduplication is being done through Confidence, but primarily because we've not had this software, I have done the deduplication within EndNote and then shared the file with the research team. So again, that sort of varies, but that is something that we're looking into a subscription to. And then again, involvement in the write-up, both for a protocol or any final publication, basically detailing the stages that I've been involved in. So that's primarily the search strategy, what's actually been done as part of the search process. In terms of write-up and authorship then, so whenever I am responsible as the lead searcher and the writer of the search methods, I do require author contribution, and then I would write up that search strategy. And I actually request to review the bits that I've sort of been involved in writing before submission. So I sort of asked to have a look through that just in case there has been changes made, because that's the bit that's my work, if that makes sense. So if that's published in a way that doesn't accurately represent my contribution to the project, to me, that needs to be sort of signed off by me. So that is something that I asked to have a look at, and I have suggested changes based on what people have sent me as well. And then I'm now going to go back to the Menti and ask for your contributions in terms of what your involvement is. And I know there's been lots of comments in the chat, so I'm going to have a look at those as you're responding. So the first one is a bar chart. Is that the right word? So again, you've got multiple options, and I'm hoping it's going to allow you to select multiple responses. If it's not, let me know and I'll just pop in and change the settings. If it's only letting you give one response, just let me know. Okay, I'm just going to quickly change that on the settings. So I'll just come out and do that, because I do want to make sure that you can give more responses here. Okay, I don't know why it's done it for the free text, but not those. Okay, right, so now should let you give more responses. If you've already responded, it might not let you. I don't know why it's done it for the free text, but it's just not had it set up for that. Okay. But for anyone who's now responding. Okay, thank you very much, Anna. So if anybody has already responded and it only gave you one, just refresh the page and it should allow you to then submit again. Okay, so somebody's put a really useful link in the chat, defining the role of authors and contributions, which has some guidance in terms of what people would be expected to write. Yeah, I'm reviewing the paper. Well, thank you. Yeah, and that recommendation is saying, you know, substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data. So I would say if somebody's involved in being the lead searcher, that's definitely can be defined as a substantial contribution. Okay, so there's lots and lots of responses coming through there. Primarily, the bulk of us who've responded there are involved in this development of the search strategy, followed by sort of running or leading on that searching. And then you can see that everything else that's in that list of options does have some people who are present having involvement in those. And I think sometimes the development of the eligibility criteria, I have had some that maybe aren't fully formed at the point where I see the initial query, and that has been done through conversation. Okay, so in terms of the selection process, I meant selecting which sources are going to be included in the review, which again, some people may be involved in, some people may not be involved in. Again, that might depend on your job role. But yeah, again, the selection of where to publish, that is something that I often get asked. Generally, we don't have a research librarian role at my institution, so the subject librarian team also have general research librarian support, so advising on scholarly publishing more widely, and that can include people getting in touch with us saying, have you got recommendations on where to publish X piece of work? Again, yeah, explaining how reference management software works, how to fill in a Prisma flowchart. All of these sort of tasks can be part of the librarian role. Okay. And we've already had some responses in the chat, but if there is anything else that you're involved with in terms of the review process or write-up that hasn't already been mentioned, feel free to sort of just add that into the Menti as well, just to capture anything else. Just a question come through in the chat as well about expanding on the development of the eligibility criteria. So that would be the criteria that's used during the selection process to assess whether a piece of source would be included in the review or not. Yep, selecting where to search, and sometimes we might be giving advice on where to search even if it's not us that's carrying that search out. Various elements of the screening and selection process and the data extraction. Yep, grant co-applicant, and I think that ties in with some of the work I've done in terms of at proposal stage. So yeah, sort of grants and proposals, grey literature, proofreading. Yeah. Choice of the type of review, yeah, that's an interesting one, because I don't know how other people feel, but sometimes somebody approaches you to say, I'm going to be doing this systematic review, and you've looked at sort of their aims and outcomes and their criteria, and actually maybe it's not quite fitting a systematic review, and maybe there's some discussion and advice there about what sort of review within that review family it might better fit with. Critical appraisal and risk of bias, deduplication, yeah, the Prisma. So I think this is just showing actually the wide range of elements and stages of a review that librarians and information specialists do have involvement with, and it's not necessarily always just that searching, and I do think that needs to sort of sometimes be recognised more widely as well. Yeah, using software like Covidence and EndNote. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go back into the slides. So we've had a little bit of a discussion about this earlier during the negotiations, but something that I'm exploring at the moment is this option of developing some form of formalised policy or procedure for my involvement in these review teams, which is something that has not existed up until now, and I can see from your previous responses, some of you do have that, and you have these sort of negotiation documents or procedures that you're able to then point to. And I want to kind of do this to formalize the task so that it is embedded in this role, so that if I left, potentially that is actually seen as a requirement of the role rather than an option of the role, but also just to help with negotiation and workload in a more official way, so that you've got this sort of document that can back up, you know, the need for costing, the need for time allocation and so on. And I don't know whether actually a more formalised agreement or contract of support would increase authorship. And I don't know whether anyone has sort of anything they want to sort of contribute here in terms of whether you've worked somewhere where this has been introduced partway through, this sort of more formalised procedures or contracts, if you will, and whether there was any change before or after, what differences you think that's made, if any. So anything that you want to sort of share there, feel free to add into the chat. I don't think I set up a Menti for that, but I'll just double check. Yes. So just to capture whether you sort of do or don't have one, I think this one will be set up for just one response, but you should only need to have one response here, so that shouldn't be a problem. So just interesting to capture whether sort of your workplace does have any sort of official documents, if you will, to formalise that involvement. So primarily people are saying no. The bulk of people are saying no, they don't have anything formalised. But there are some people that do. And again, I think that will potentially differ in terms of your workplace, whether it is an information specialist team, whether it's seen as something that's ad hoc to the role, and so on. And for those of you who do have these types of documents particularly, how sort of do you find them to be beneficial or useful, or potentially not? And I can see that there's been a couple of comments already in the chat, but if anybody again might not have these already, but you're in the process of considering that, if you want to share anything about, you know, your progress, or again why you might be looking at this, that's completely fine as well. I can see a couple of people have shared where their guiding agreements are public. There's a link in there, which is great. Thank you. Okay, so there's a mix of people who have been using them quite regularly and use them, you know, to help define and set these parameters and levels of involvement. And then there's a few people who are already saying that they've, you know, just in development, quite new or not been used that many times. And that's an interesting comment as well, that like I think I've been seeing this from the perspective potentially of giving a clearer idea to researchers, but actually it can also be this helpful reminder for library staff about what we can offer. So it's not only doing the job of, you know, setting parameters and levels for others, but actually for ourselves and reminding us of what we do and don't do. Yeah, clarity on both sides, yeah. Okay, and that's a slightly different interpretation as well, in terms of, does that document then sort of set some things in stone that might not always be possible? So being quite careful about how that's potentially worded and developed as well. Yeah, do we actually have the capacity to implement this? If we're formalizing it as a policy or a procedure of something that we do, can we actually make sure we implement that? Yeah, and that's a good point as well, that maybe not all librarians are comfortable covering everything that's involved in that. So if you're working within a team of people and it's not just about your individual involvement, then ensuring as a team which areas of reviews you might be you know, some people might be more confident or less confident with, and happy to conduct and support. Okay. So we've done that already. And then there are a few sort of areas of concerns that I have that have sort of been raised sort of already, that there's this balance and prioritization for me of this evidence synthesis work with the other tasks. And we've already sort of had some chats in that Menti in terms of the fact that other people really feel this pressure and this prioritization. And actually, if that's not the sole responsibility of your job, how do you then get that right balance? And again, I think that links into some of the things that have just come through there about capacity, and if we set this out as a procedure, are we then committing more time to something that we may not have the capacity for? Now, in terms of my colleagues, I am the only sort of health and social care librarian, and I think historically, as we're all aware, reviews and evidence synthesis have primarily been a healthcare sort of role. I do have a new colleague that started last year who has done this in their previous job. So actually that person's not supporting my school, they support the applied sciences, but they've actually come in with more of this knowledge and expertise as well. And through the fact that we're having more requests and interest from, you know, multidisciplinary areas for this kind of support, we're now as a team starting to look at more support beyond healthcare for these, and we are actually running a new workshop this year on systematic approaches to literature reviews that is not healthcare specific, and our current guidance is very healthcare focused, and again we're looking at developing a separation of more multidisciplinary guidance, and we're looking at reviews that are undertaken in these wider areas like business and engineering and education, and looking at, is there any sort of you know, guidance for conducting or reporting or particular tools that are used within other areas and field groups that are outside of healthcare, so that we can promote more of these multidisciplinary tools. And this is because of this increased demand, not only within my school, but then across other schools. So given that we are subject librarians and that we are aligned to specific schools, if there's a lot of interest in the business school, it's not necessarily appropriate to just offload that onto the healthcare librarian. But then it's a case of, does the business school librarian therefore need to also skill up in this to ensure it's being delivered across multiple schools? So these are kind of the stage that I'm at the moment, having negotiations with colleagues about how we develop this as a team, but also looking at more formalized documentary sort of procedures around this as well. And again, I'm just going to go back to the Menti so that you can share any further worries, but I think most of that, I did not put that into the presentation. We have reached the end of the Menti presentation, so we'll just use the chat if you've got any further concerns and worries that we haven't already sort of discussed earlier on. And I'm just going to double check in the chat if there's anything else. Where did I go? Okay, I'm not going to go through the chat about deduplication and tools. I'll just skip through that bit. There's a question about sort of formal and informal training. So I think a lot of that was done at a previous university where we had a bigger team of librarians and we had multiple people who worked within the healthcare school. So we all sort of had smaller areas within the school that we supported. So some of that was like peer learning from colleagues. And then I have been on formal evidence synthesis programs and training courses, so delivered by sort of institutions like SHAR, for example, and similar departments, primarily UK institutions, mainly online actually, which is useful when you live in Edinburgh and it's quite a far away to get to some of these places on the train. Okay. So we've got another 5 minutes to wrap up with questions. So I'll I'll put my Q&A slide on.
Hi,
I haven't
Maria.
looked in the Q&A at all yet, Bob, so...
It's okay. I've got things in the Q&A. There are quite a few questions, obviously, because it's been a really engaging talk. And can we just say thank you for that? And thanks to everyone who attended and engaged too. It was a great two-way conversation, I think. So if we start on the Q&As, Maria, if that's all right. And if we don't get through them, are we okay to send them through to you to follow up afterwards?
Fine, yeah.
Brilliant. So first one I managed to copy across was, going to go through in order. So from Isla, so if it's not mentioned in your job role, what would happen if you leave? Will it become part of your role if it were to be advertised in future, given that you've created this expectation in your school?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I am having these conversations with colleagues and sort of as a team to look at that, because I think if I left, I don't think it would be put in the job role, because the way that our sort of job roles are written, they're not school specific. So it's the same job description for every subject librarian, no matter which school you support. So I don't think that would ever actually change, but there could potentially be a requirement that in the job advert it was maybe mentioned as a desirable, something that was of interest, and that could be something that is taken into consideration in a maybe a willingness to train in this area, even if somebody didn't already have that knowledge. But I don't see it necessarily being formalized just because of the genericness across the different.
Great, thanks. And the second one's from Paola. What do you, do you only work on funded reviews?
No. So most of the reviews I work on probably aren't funded. So the Scottish Government one was a big funded one recently, and I've got another 2 or 3 sort of funded ones over the last year. But quite a lot of them might be somebody internal within that school. It might be internal funding, but they might just have an idea of a review. And quite often, and this sort of links into another question that's come up in the chat about, do you only deal with systematic reviews? How do you deal with things that aren't really systematic reviews? We would work on a scoping review, for example, in just the same way. So quite a lot of those reviews tend to be non-funded.
Great. There's another one here from Isla. She says, not really expecting an answer, but if your manager doesn't consider this work useful enough to protect your time and the money goes to some big pot in the sky, why are we asking for money in the first place?
That is a good question. I have wondered why I bother asking for the money if it doesn't come back to my team. And my manager is in agreement with me, don't worry. My manager is also saying, why am I not getting that back to our team budget as a minimum? So that is a good question that both me and my manager are asking.
And it's a nice comment really from Joshua. So some supervisors seem to be operating under a slight misapprehension, confusion of terminology, occasionally get panicked. Undergraduate and postgrad students who've been asked to do a full SR by their supervisor, more just a literature review done systematically. And I experienced this a lot in my job as well. And I didn't know if that happens in your area.
It does, and I'm quite well embedded in my school, so I am asked to come and do teaching sessions with all postgraduate students who are doing their dissertations, and one of my teaching slides says in very big letters, you are not doing a systematic review. So that message is very much shared by me, and the academic staff teaching on those modules know that I'm sharing that message, and to be honest, they are actually quite good at also passing that message on. But I know previous places I've worked at, that has not always been the case. So yes, I feel your pain there, Josh.
Thanks. There's quite a lot more to get through, and I know people are slowly leaving. So there was just something that Louise wanted me to share in the chat, and it's the self-taught SR community of practice, and describes it as a safe space born from the SR conversations where questions can be asked. So I'll post that in the chat. And just once again, thanks a lot, Maria, for your time, and thanks everyone. And we will follow up with a feedback form and stay in touch and look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you. And there's also a question in the chat about, can they have access to the Menti replies? So I will download that report and send it through to Louise so that she can share it as well.
Great.
Brilliant. Nice to meet you, Bob.
Yes, nice to meet you all. Nice to meet you all, everyone. And you'll see Louise next time, hopefully not me.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.